Get out of my lobby right now. These words echoed through the marble halls of Manhattan's Grand Meridian Hotel, directed at a woman who had just flown 6 hours from Los Angeles for the most important board meeting of her career. Victoria Sterling stood frozen in the opulent lobby, her Hermes bag clutched tightly in her manicured hands, as security guards approached her like she was a common criminal. What happened next would expose a rot so deep within America's luxury hospitality industry that it would spark a revolution. Because in exactly 9 minutes, this unwanted guest would reveal herself as the CEO and majority shareholder of the very hotel trying to throw her out. What would you do if you were fired from the company you owned? The irony was about to become legendary. The humiliation was about to become justice. But first, let's go back to where it all began. 7:43 p.m. on a Tuesday evening that would change everything. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. Victoria Sterling had arrived at the Grand Meridian with one simple goal: check into the presidential suite she'd reserved for tomorrow's emergency board meeting. The red-eye flight from L.A. had left her looking less than her usual polished self. Jeans, a simple blazer, her natural hair pulled back in a messy bun. She'd opted for comfort over corporate glamour, a decision that would prove more costly than she could have imagined. The lobby gleamed with its usual opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across Italian marble floors. Well-dressed guests moved through the space with the quiet confidence that comes with wealth. Victoria approached the concierge desk, pulling out her platinum card and reservation confirmation. Victoria. "Good evening," she said to Sarah, the young blonde receptionist whose name tag gleamed under the lights. "I have a reservation under Sterling Presidential Suite." Sarah's eyes flickered over Victoria's casual attire, her expression shifting almost imperceptibly. "Sarah, I'll need to see some identification," she said, her tone already carrying a note of skepticism. Victoria handed over her driver's license without comment. Sarah studied it for an uncomfortably long time, typing slowly on her computer, her brow furrowed as she glanced between the screen and Victoria's face. "Sarah. Ma'am, I'm going to need additional verification. This reservation is for our most exclusive suite and—" Sarah paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound as discriminatory as her thoughts. "Well, we need to ensure everything is legitimate." The subtext hung in the air like smoke. Victoria had heard it before, the polite questioning that black people faced in spaces where their presence was deemed unlikely, unwelcome, or impossible. Her jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. "Victoria, what additional verification do you need? I have my credit card, my confirmation number, and my identification. What else could you possibly require?" Sarah's discomfort was palpable. She glanced around the lobby, catching the attention of Marcus Thompson, the night manager. Marcus was a man in his 40s with thinning hair and the particular brand of confidence that came from 20 years in luxury hospitality. He approached the desk with purposeful strides. "Marcus, is there a problem here?" Marcus asked, his eyes immediately assessing Victoria with undisguised suspicion. "Sarah. This guest is trying to check into the presidential suite," Sarah explained, relief evident in her voice at having backup. "But I'm having trouble verifying the reservation." Marcus studied Victoria's identification, then looked at her again. His expression hardened. "Marcus. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. This reservation doesn't seem to be legitimate, and frankly, you don't appear to be the typical clientele for our presidential accommodations." The words hit like a physical blow. Around them, other guests had begun to notice the commotion. Phones were discreetly pulled out, cameras potentially recording. Victoria felt the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up her neck, but also something else, a cold, calculating anger. "Victoria, I assure you the reservation is completely legitimate. I'd like to speak with your general manager immediately." Marcus. "Mr. Wilson doesn't meet with guests unless they're actually, guests. I'm going to have to ask you to leave before we call security." She had a choice: surrender or fight back. What Marcus didn't realize was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Victoria Sterling didn't just have a reservation at the Grand Meridian, she owned it. Every marble tile, every crystal chandelier, every thread in the Egyptian cotton sheets upstairs. But more than that, she was about to discover just how deep the problem went. The humiliation was swift and brutal. Marcus had gestured to the hotel's security team, two large men who approached Victoria with the kind of professional indifference that comes from years of removing undesirable guests. The lobby, which had been buzzing with quiet conversation, fell silent as every eye turned to watch the scene unfold. Security guard. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to escort you out," the lead security guard said, his hand gesturing toward the exit. Victoria looked around at the faces staring at her, some with curiosity, others with the uncomfortable recognition of witnessing something wrong, a few with barely concealed satisfaction at seeing someone they assumed didn't belong being put in their place. The familiar sting of tears threatened, but she blinked them back. She would not give them the satisfaction. "Victoria." "This is a mistake," she said one final time, her voice carrying across the marble expanse. "A very expensive mistake." But her words fell on deaf ears. The security guards flanked her as she walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the floor in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Every step felt like a mile. Every whisper from the watching crowd felt like a shout. Outside, the cool Manhattan evening air hit her face like a slap. Paparazzi, always lurking around the hotel's entrance hoping to catch celebrities, began snapping photos of what they assumed was simply another evening drama. Victoria stood on the sidewalk, feeling smaller than she had since childhood, when other kids had questioned whether she belonged in advanced classes, at the country club, in spaces where her presence challenged their assumptions. But this time was different. This time, they had messed with the wrong woman. She pulled out her phone with hands that barely trembled and called her driver. While she waited, the full weight of what had just happened settled over her. It wasn't just personal humiliation. It was systemic failure. If this could happen to her, the actual owner of the hotel, what was happening to other black guests? Other people of color who walked into establishments where their humanity was questioned before their money? The Bentley pulled up, and as Victoria slid into the leather interior, she made a decision that would change everything. Her assistant would later describe the phone call she received as the most terrifying conversation of her career. Not because Victoria shouted or threatened, but because her voice carried the cold precision of someone who had just declared war. They had forgotten one crucial detail. Victoria didn't speak immediately when her driver asked for directions. Instead, she sat in the back of the Bentley, her mind shifting from the emotional devastation of humiliation to the strategic calculation of justice. 20 years of building her hospitality empire had taught her that real power wasn't in displays of anger. It was in methodical, precise action. She called Elena, her executive assistant, who answered on the first ring despite the late hour. Elena. "Victoria, how did the—" "Cancel my morning meetings?" "Victoria, I need an emergency board meeting via video conference in 30 minutes. Don't tell them why. All of them, now." Her next call was to her head of HR, Janet. "Victoria. Janet, I need complete personnel files for the Grand Meridian night shift staff, management level and below. I want disciplinary records, training certifications, customer complaints, everything. Send it to my secure email within the hour." The third call was to her legal team. David Chen, her lead attorney, sounded groggy when he answered. David Chen. "Victoria, is everything all right?" "Victoria, define all right. I need you to research discrimination lawsuits in the hospitality industry, precedents, settlement amounts, criminal charges. And David, start preparing papers for individual lawsuits against employees. I want to know what happens when hotel staff violate anti-discrimination policies so egregiously that it damages the company's reputation." By the time the Bentley reached her Manhattan penthouse, Victoria had made 7 phone calls. Each one had been strategic, building towards something that would make what happened in that lobby look like a minor inconvenience. She wasn't seeking revenge. She was demanding accountability. There was a difference, and that difference would matter in the hours to come. One call would change everything. The first domino fell at 9:47 p.m. when Victoria dialed the direct line to David Wilson, the Grand Meridian's general manager. Wilson answered on the fourth ring, his voice carrying the casual confidence of a man who had no idea he was about to have the worst conversation of his professional life. David Wilson. Wilson speaking. Victoria. David, this is Victoria Sterling. There was a pause. Wilson clearly recognized the name. As GM, he would have seen executive communications, but he couldn't place why the CEO of Sterling Hospitality Group would be calling him directly at this hour. David Wilson. Miss Sterling, how can I help you? Victoria. I understand there was an incident in your lobby tonight. A black woman was removed from the premises by your security team. I'd like to discuss your staff's handling of the situation. Wilson's tone immediately shifted to defensive professionalism. David Wilson. I haven't received any reports of incidents tonight, ma'am. If there was a disturbance, I'm sure my night manager handled it appropriately. We have very strict protocols about maintaining the comfort and safety of our legitimate guests. Victoria. Legitimate guests. Interesting phrase. Tell me, David, what makes a guest legitimate in your establishment? David Wilson. Well, proper identification, valid reservations, appropriate presentation. You understand, Miss Sterling, the Grand Meridian maintains a certain standard. Victoria felt something cold settle in her chest. Victoria. And you're confident your staff acted appropriately tonight? David Wilson. Absolutely. Marcus Thompson is one of our most experienced managers. If he determined someone didn't belong in our establishment, I trust his judgment completely. There was a long silence. When Victoria spoke again, her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Victoria. David, I want you to pull the security footage from tonight, specifically the footage of the black woman your staff removed from the lobby around 8 p.m. David Wilson. Miss Sterling, I don't think that's necessary. Company policy doesn't typically pull the footage. Victoria. David, watch it carefully, then call me back. David Wilson. But why would you... Victoria. Because... Victoria said, her words falling like stones into still water. That black woman you're so confident didn't belong? That was me. The silence that followed was so complete, Victoria could hear Wilson's breathing change. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. David Wilson. That's not possible. Victoria. 30 minutes, David. Watch the footage, then we'll discuss exactly how impossible it is. David Wilson had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The moment of truth had arrived. At 11:03 p.m., Victoria Sterling returned to the Grand Meridian Hotel. But this time, she didn't walk through the front lobby. Instead, she used her private key card to access the executive elevator that led directly to the 50th floor, to the boardroom that overlooked the entire city, and where, in exactly 12 minutes, she would address her board of directors via video conference. The elevator ride gave her 60 seconds to center herself, 60 seconds to transition from the humiliated woman who had been escorted out 2 hours earlier to the CEO who was about to demonstrate exactly why crossing her had been the most expensive mistake these employees would ever make. The boardroom was exactly as she had left it 3 days earlier. Polished mahogany table, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Manhattan's glittering skyline, and a wall-mounted screen that would soon display the faces of 7 board members who were about to witness the most dramatic personnel action in the company's history. At exactly 11:15 p.m., the screen flickered to life. 7 faces appeared in individual video windows. Her board of directors, pulled from their evening routines for what they assumed was a financial emergency. Victoria had built Sterling Hospitality Group from nothing, and these people trusted her judgment implicitly. That trust was about to be tested. Victoria. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me on short notice. We have a situation that requires immediate board approval for personnel actions. Robert Hayes, board chairman. Victoria, interrupted board chairman Robert Hayes. It's nearly midnight on the East Coast. What situation could possibly require this? Victoria. The situation, Robert, where your CEO was physically removed from her own hotel by security, because staff members assumed a black woman couldn't possibly be a legitimate guest. The silence that followed was profound. 7 successful business leaders, people who had navigated decades of corporate crisis, sat speechless as the implications crashed over them. Board member Patricia Chen was the first to recover. Patricia Chen. Victoria, are you saying that you were discriminated against at the Grand Meridian tonight? Victoria. I'm saying that systematic failures in our hiring, training, and oversight policies resulted in staff members removing the majority shareholder from the property based solely on racial profiling. Victoria's voice remained steady, but everyone on the call could hear the steel beneath. I'm also saying that we have documented evidence of 12 previous complaints against 1 employee that were mishandled, inadequate diversity training, and a management structure that enabled tonight's incident. Robert Hayes. What are you requesting from the board? Victoria. Authorization for immediate termination of 4 employees, suspension of current management pending investigation, implementation of emergency diversity training, and approval for external legal counsel to investigate potential criminal charges for violation of civil rights laws. James Liu, board member. Criminal charges? Board member James Lau looked stunned. Victoria, don't you think that's extreme? Victoria, James, when employees of a public accommodation remove a customer based solely on race, that's not just a personnel issue. That's a federal civil rights violation. And when those employees cost this company potentially millions in negative publicity and legal exposure, that's corporate negligence. She clicked a remote, and the main screen shifted to security footage from the lobby. Victoria. I'm going to show you exactly what happened tonight. Then you can decide if my response is extreme. The revelation was about to destroy everything. The security footage played in devastating clarity. Even through the grainy hotel cameras, every moment of Victoria's humiliation was visible. The skeptical looks, the dismissive gestures, the careful positioning of security guards, the walk of shame past staring guests. When the video ended, the silence from the board was deafening. Sarah Martinez, board member. My God, whispered board member Sarah Martinez. Victoria, I am so sorry. Victoria. Sorry doesn't fix this, but accountability does. Marcus Thompson has 12 documented complaints of discriminatory behavior that were swept under the rug. Sarah Collins was put in a customer-facing role without basic diversity training. David Wilson just spent 30 minutes on the phone defending their actions, even after I told him who I was. Robert Hayes. What's your recommendation for action? Victoria. Complete termination of Marcus Thompson, Sarah Collins, and David Wilson. Effective immediately. Implementation of mandatory diversity training for all staff within 30 days. External audit of all guest complaints over the past 5 years. And personal lawsuits against the terminated employees for damages to company reputation and personal defamation. Patricia Chen. Personal lawsuits? Patricia Chen looked concerned. Victoria, that seems vindictive. Victoria. Patricia, every employee signs an agreement, acknowledging that their actions reflect on the company. Tonight's incident will generate negative media coverage, potential boycotts, and legal liability. The economic damage from their discriminatory behavior will be measurable in millions. If they want to engage in behavior that costs the company money, they can be held personally liable for those costs. Michael Torres, board member. Board member Michael Torres, who had been quiet throughout the presentation, finally spoke. The legal exposure alone justifies immediate action. If we don't respond decisively, we're looking at federal investigations, civil rights lawsuits, and potentially criminal charges. Victoria. Exactly, Victoria said. This isn't revenge. This is risk management, and it's long overdue. Robert Hayes. Robert Hayes called for a formal vote. All in favor of authorizing CEO Sterling's recommended personnel actions? 7 hands raised simultaneously. Robert Hayes. Motion carries unanimously, Hayes announced. Victoria, you have full board support for immediate implementation. Victoria. Victoria nodded once. Thank you. James Morrison, head of security, is waiting outside. He'll escort the terminated employees from the premises tonight. New management will be in place by morning. As the board call ended, Victoria remained standing at the head of the table, looking out at the city lights. In less than 4 hours, she had gone from humiliated victim to corporate executioner. But the real work was just beginning. Justice was swift, but the consequences would last forever. The next 6 months unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony of accountability. Victoria had underestimated neither the legal ramifications nor the media firestorm that would follow. Within 48 hours, security footage of her removal had leaked to social media, generating millions of views and hashtags that kept the story trending for weeks. Marcus Thompson's termination was just the beginning of his troubles. Victoria's legal team had filed individual lawsuits against him, David Wilson, and the hotel's parent management company for violation of civil rights laws, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The discovery process revealed Thompson's history went deeper than anyone had realized. Text messages mocking guests of color, social media posts expressing explicitly racist views, and testimony from former colleagues about his pattern of discriminatory behavior. The first court hearing took place on a cold February morning. Victoria sat in the plaintiff's section, impeccably dressed in a navy suit that cost more than Thompson earned in a month. Across the aisle, Thompson looked diminished, unemployed, facing bankruptcy from legal fees, and unable to find work in hospitality after word of the incident spread throughout the industry. His attorney, an overworked public defender, made the predictable arguments. Thompson's attorney: "Your Honor, Mr. Thompson was following established security protocols. He had no way of knowing Miss Sterling's identity, and his actions were not motivated by racial animus, but by legitimate security concerns." David Chen. Victoria's attorney, David Chen, stood to respond. His voice carried the weight of documented evidence. "Your Honor, we will demonstrate that Mr. Thompson's actions were part of a pattern of discriminatory behavior spanning years, 12 formal complaints, documented inappropriate comments, and a history of treating black guests differently than white guests. This was not a security protocol. This was racial profiling that violated both civil rights laws and basic human decency." The testimony was damning. Former guests testified about Thompson's treatment, colleagues described his inappropriate comments, and expert witnesses explained how implicit bias training could have prevented the entire incident. Thompson himself took the stand, his attempts to justify his actions only making things worse. Marcus Thompson: "I was protecting the hotel's reputation," he insisted. "Someone dressed casually trying to access our most expensive suite. That's unusual." David Chen: "Mr. Thompson, how many white guests have you questioned for being casually dressed?" Thompson's silence spoke volumes. David Chen: "How many white guests have you had removed by security for not looking like they belonged?" More silence. "In fact, Mr. Thompson, isn't it true that on the same night you removed Miss Sterling, you personally assisted 3 white guests who were dressed even more casually and never questioned their right to be there?" The courtroom was silent as Thompson's attorney objected, but the damage was done. Security footage from that same evening showed Thompson cheerfully helping white guests in jeans and t-shirts while treating Victoria with suspicion and hostility. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. The verdict was unanimous: $2,100,000 in damages against Thompson personally, $3,400,000 against the hotel management company, and a court order requiring comprehensive civil rights training for all employees. As the verdict was read, Thompson broke down completely. His wife had already filed for divorce, his house was in foreclosure, and his reputation in the hospitality industry was destroyed beyond repair. Sarah Collins, who had received a smaller judgment, was working at a fast food restaurant while attending court-ordered sensitivity training. David Wilson had fared slightly better, finding work as a shift supervisor at a budget motel chain, but his career in luxury hospitality was over. The industry was small, and word traveled fast about managers who created liability for their employers. But the reckoning had only just begun. The legal victory was satisfying, but Victoria understood that real change required systematic transformation. The Sterling Standards, as they came to be known, became the hospitality industry's gold standard for inclusive service. What started as a response to one terrible night evolved into a comprehensive framework that addressed every aspect of guest interaction. And the first component was hiring. Victoria mandated that all customer-facing positions required demonstrated cultural competency, not just hospitality experience. Applicants underwent scenarios, testing their ability to serve diverse clientele with equal respect and professionalism. Training became intensive and ongoing. Instead of annual diversity workshops that employees ignored, Victoria implemented monthly simulations, quarterly assessments, and immediate coaching for any staff member who showed signs of bias. Guest interaction was monitored through mystery shoppers from diverse backgrounds, and discriminatory behavior resulted in immediate termination. But the most revolutionary change was accountability. Every guest complaint was investigated by external auditors, not internal staff who might be inclined to protect colleagues. Settlements were no longer quiet affairs handled by lawyers. They were public acknowledgments of failure, with detailed explanations of corrective action. The Sterling standard spread beyond Victoria's own hotels. Competitors, facing pressure from civil rights organizations and potential boycotts, adopted similar policies. Industry conferences featured panels on inclusive hospitality. Hotel management schools added required coursework on cultural competency. Within 2 years, discrimination complaints across the luxury hospitality sector had dropped by 67%. More importantly, guests of color began reporting positive experiences at hotels where they had previously felt unwelcome. Victoria received hundreds of letters from travelers, thanking her for making spaces accessible that had once felt hostile. The economic impact was equally significant. Hotels implementing the Sterling standard saw increased bookings from diverse clientele, positive media coverage, and reduced legal liability. What started as crisis management became competitive advantage. Victoria found herself testifying before congressional committees, investigating discrimination in public accommodations. Her story became a case study in business schools about crisis management and social responsibility. She was invited to speak at civil rights conferences, corporate diversity summits, and hospitality industry gatherings. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The NAACP presented Victoria with their corporate leadership award, not for being a successful Black CEO, but for using her position to create systemic change that benefited everyone. The call to action and lasting impact. Change was no longer optional. It was inevitable. Standing at the podium of the National Civil Rights Museum, 2 years after that humiliating night, Victoria Sterling reflected on the journey from victim to catalyst. The audience, a mix of civil rights leaders, hospitality executives, and young professionals, waited for her to speak about triumph and vindication. Instead, she talked about systems. Victoria, the night at the Grand Meridian, wasn't about bad people making individual bad choices, she began. It was about systems designed to exclude, policies written to protect institutions rather than people, and training programs that treated discrimination as a public relations problem rather than a moral crisis. She paused, looking out at faces that represented every background, every struggle, every victory in the long march toward equality. Victoria, I had advantages those employees couldn't have anticipated. I had money, lawyers, media access, and corporate power. But what about the countless others who faced the same? Treatment without those advantages? What about the families turned away from hotels? The business travelers humiliated in lobbies? The young people who internalize the message that they don't belong in spaces they've earned the right to occupy? The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Victoria, discrimination isn't just wrong because it hurts people, although it absolutely does that. It's wrong because it's economically stupid, morally bankrupt, and strategically counterproductive. When we exclude people based on assumptions about their worth, we lose their talent, their money, their perspectives, and their contributions. Victoria's voice strengthened, carrying the authority of someone who had transformed pain into purpose. Victoria. But here's what I learned in that lobby. Standing there as security guards approached me like I was a threat. Dignity isn't something other people can give you or take away. It's something you carry inside yourself. And it's something you extend to others regardless of how they treat you. She smiled, and for the first time in the speech, her corporate composure softened into something more personal. I didn't fire those employees because I wanted revenge. I fired them because their behavior was incompatible with the values of an organization that serves the public. There's a difference between accountability and vindictiveness, between justice and retaliation. One builds better systems. The other just perpetuates cycles of harm. The standing ovation lasted 4 minutes. But more important than the applause were the conversations that followed. Young professionals sharing their own experiences, executives committing to policy changes, activists discussing collaboration opportunities. That night, Victoria returned to the Grand Meridian. She still owned it, but now it looked different. The staff was more diverse, the training was more comprehensive, and the guest experience was more inclusive. The lobby where she had been humiliated now displayed a small plaque. In recognition of our commitment to serving all guests with dignity and respect. She didn't need the plaque. The real recognition was in the black family checking in without incident, the elderly Latina woman receiving exceptional service, the young Muslim man in traditional dress being greeted with the same warmth as every other guest. Respect isn't earned. It's a human right. As Victoria walked through her hotel that night, she thought about the young girl she had been, the one who had been told she didn't belong in advanced classes, exclusive clubs, or leadership positions. That girl would have been amazed to see what was possible when you refused to accept other people's limitations on your worth. But she also thought about Marcus Thompson, unemployed and struggling with the consequences of his choices. Sarah Collins, working her way through community college while learning to recognize her own biases. David Wilson, slowly rebuilding a career while grappling with how he had failed as a leader. There was no satisfaction in their suffering. Victoria had learned that true power wasn't in destroying people who wronged you. It was in creating systems where such wrongs became impossible. The hospitality industry would never be the same. Other industries were taking notice, implementing their own versions of the Sterling Standards. Universities were revising their curricula. Corporations were updating their policies. And a generation of young professionals was entering the workforce with different expectations about inclusion and respect. Change was happening, one policy at a time, one training session at a time, one transformed workplace at a time. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from her executive assistant. Confirmation received. Your keynote speaker at the International Hospitality Inclusion Summit next month. They're expecting over 10,000 attendees. She smiled, remembering the woman who had stood on a Manhattan sidewalk just 2 years earlier, feeling smaller than she had since childhood. That woman had made a choice, not to accept humiliation as inevitable, but to transform it into opportunity. Do you believe that one call can change everything? The question echoed in her mind as she walked toward the elevator that would take her to the penthouse suite. The same suite she had been denied access to that night. But now she wasn't just staying there as a guest or even as an owner. She was staying there as someone who had proven that individual actions, multiplied by strategic thinking and sustained effort, could reshape entire industries. Tomorrow she would fly to Chicago for another speaking engagement, then to Los Angeles for a board meeting, then to Atlanta for a conference on corporate social responsibility. Her calendar was full of opportunities to share what she had learned, that discrimination was not just a moral failing but a business liability. That inclusion was not just the right thing to do but the smart thing to do. And that change was possible when people with power chose to use it responsibly. The elevator doors closed, and Victoria saw her reflection in the polished steel. Successful, confident, and at peace with the journey that had brought her here. She had started as a victim and become a catalyst. She had experienced humiliation and created transformation. She had faced systematic discrimination and built systematic solutions. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned that justice and revenge were not the same thing. Justice built bridges. Revenge built walls. Justice created opportunities. Revenge created cycles of harm. Justice transformed systems. Revenge just changed who held power within broken systems. As the elevator rose toward the top floor, Victoria Sterling smiled. She had kept her promise to herself and to everyone who had ever felt unwelcome in spaces they had earned the right to occupy. The work wasn't finished. It never would be completely finished, but it was undeniably, measurably, transformatively better. And that, she thought, was worth every moment of that terrible night. When security guards had escorted her from her own hotel, in a world that tries to diminish you, standing tall is a revolutionary act. The next morning, Victoria woke to news that 3 more major hotel chains had announced adoption of the Sterling standards. Her phone was full of interview requests, speaking invitations, and messages from travelers sharing positive experiences at hotels that had implemented her policies. She dressed carefully, the same Armani suit she had been wearing that night. But now it felt different. Not armor against judgment, but a uniform for justice. Not protection against discrimination, but preparation for transformation. As she walked through the Grand Meridian lobby one final time before heading to the airport, Victoria noticed a young black woman checking in at the front desk. The interaction was smooth, professional, respectful. Everything it should be, but hadn't always been. The young woman caught her eye and smiled. Young woman, excuse me, but aren't you Victoria Sterling? Victoria nodded. I just wanted to say thank you. I travel for work, and hotels used to be difficult for me, but not anymore. What you did changed everything. Victoria, what I did was refuse to accept that discrimination was inevitable. But what you are doing, continuing to travel, continuing to take up space in these environments, that's what makes the change real. As Victoria walked toward her car, she thought about the ripple effects of that terrible night. Marcus Thompson had lost his job, but hundreds of hotel workers had received better training. David Wilson had lost his career trajectory, but thousands of guests now received better service. Sarah Collins had faced consequences for her actions, but an entire generation of hospitality workers was learning to serve all guests with equal respect. Driver. The driver held the car door open. Airport, Miss Sterling? Victoria. Airport, she confirmed. But take the long way. I want to see the city. As the Bentley pulled into Manhattan traffic, Victoria Sterling, CEO, majority shareholder, and accidental civil rights pioneer, settled back into the leather seats and watched the city wake up. Somewhere in those buildings were people getting ready for work, preparing to serve customers, making decisions about how to treat others. Some of them would make the wrong choices, but increasingly, more of them would make the right ones, not because they were better people, but because they worked in better systems, systems that Victoria had helped create from the ashes of her own humiliation. Where are you watching from? Share this story if you believe in justice. The car merged onto the highway toward JFK, carrying Victoria toward her next speaking engagement, her next opportunity to share the lesson. She had learned on the marble floors of the Grand Meridian that dignity was not negotiable, that respect was not optional, and that change was always possible when people refused to accept the unacceptable. Behind them, the Grand Meridian rose into the Manhattan sky, its windows reflecting the morning sun like a beacon. Inside those walls, guests from every background were being served with equal respect. Employees were working in an environment that valued their humanity, and managers were leading with accountability rather than assumption. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect, but it was profoundly, measurably, transformatively better. And sometimes, Victoria thought, as the city disappeared behind them, better was enough to change the world.